The basic thing I'd like to do is just sort of look at a few points that we should keep in mind as we reassess the education of our children and seek to give them a relevant education, an education that would maintain the survival of our people and advance the interests of our people. Too often, as I've said many times, and I'll repeat again, we as African people, particularly in America, and I think perhaps in the world in general, tend to perceive education merely as a preparation for jobs. And often when we admonish our children about education, we talk to them in terms of the jobs they'll either get or will not get as a result of not being educated. And we seek to motivate them in terms of the jobs or the opportunities or the quality of life they will achieve or not achieve if they are not educated in a particular sort of way. I do not deny that that is an essential reason for becoming educated. Certainly, people want to either maintain a standard of living that they already appreciate very much, or they want to increase or enhance the quality of their lives, which in this culture requires further education. And therefore, that this motive for being educated is a central one. However, I think we should also look at education in a broader sense. That education is not a mere individual achievement. That education is not something that one gets in exclusion to what else is going on in the world. Education is a social process, and ultimately it only makes sense within a social system. It only makes sense as a part of a social context. We must then move beyond viewing education merely as an individual achievement or as an achievement that will merely enhance the individual life or maybe the narrow family lives of certain people. Every culture engages in education in one form or another. It doesn't matter how so-called primitive the culture may be or how advanced the culture may be. There is still a process that we may call education taking place. Even if it's the learning of how to fish or how to hunt or how to gather or how to cook or how to do agriculture or how to perform priestly duties or other roles, the medicinal role in the society or other kinds of roles in a more so-called primitive society or advanced society, the person must be trained in one way or the other or taught in one way or the other. Even if the individual is taught to perform a particular job, that particular job is a part of a network of jobs, a system of jobs, each one interdependent upon the other, each one forming a complex web by means of which a social system is held together and protects itself and advances its interest. So even if the individual thinks that he or she is getting an education for him or herself alone, when you look at that role or that job that the individual is performing, it is really a part of a network of jobs, a network of roles, which together then maintains a social system and protects the interests of a people and advances the interests of that people, you see. So when you look at jobs and when you look at preparing for roles, you must look beyond just what it will do for you as an individual or your family as a group. You must also look at those jobs in the context of your social group, of your society. The United States here, for instance, the United States government, and you look at a person like Reagan who claims to be so capitalistic. But when he recognized that if he followed the capitalistic mode of doing things, that is, letting the market determine what businesses would remain and what businesses would go out. He recognized, though, that a very vital industry in terms of the defense of this nation could not be permitted to go, even though market forces would dictate that they would go. For instance, the so-called semiconductor business that's very important to computers and the making of computers. Now, it would be quite possible, given the market forces, that the United States would not have that kind of industry, period, because the Japanese are so much more competitive and better at producing the semiconductors, and just order their semiconductors from Japan or from South Korea, somewhere like that. But they recognized that to put themselves in this situation would be to put themselves in jeopardy, to put the nation in jeopardy. It would mean that vital parts of their computers and vital parts of their computer programs would be known to other nations and other people, that they would be dependent upon other nations and people. And therefore, in time of war, in times of defending themselves, they would not be able to get the correct parts, or the other nations manufacturing these parts would be very much aware of the nature and design of their defense systems. They also recognize that they must have people within the country itself who are capable of performing the manufacturing jobs and the other jobs related to these semiconductors. In other words, to lose these people and to lose these kinds of workers are not only losses to the people who might have had these jobs, but ultimately are a loss to the nation itself and puts the nation, makes the nation vulnerable to its enemies. Even such a blue-collar job, such as, what do we call it, a machinist, which seems to be a relatively pedestrian job, is a very, very vital job for national defense. A machinist, a top-notch machinist, can literally make an engine, an automobile engine, a jet engine, and so forth, and you would think that all this engineer is doing or whatever is drilling holes in blocks of iron and steel. It's extremely vital. This kind of job is not merely then a job for that man or that woman to feed himself or his family. That job is intimately related to the defense of this nation and to the defense of the Western Hemisphere. To lose those kinds of jobs and to lose that kind of role means then the country becomes vulnerable to its enemies and possibly will be defeated in war. The auto worker is not just an auto worker. Those assembly lines in times of war become assembly lines for making tanks and other vital materials. A nation that has industrial power, and yet while in peace that industrial power is used to feed consumer needs, can turn that industrial power to feed consumer needs into industrial power for military needs and for defense. The point that I'm trying to get at here is then that jobs may be looked upon as mere jobs, but they're not merely that. Jobs and the roles people play are vital to the people themselves. And ultimately, the job that one performs depends upon other people, of course, supporting that job, either by buying the products that you are producing or supporting the service in one way or the other that you're providing. In other words, you cannot have a job in a sense of any social value if you live in the world totally alone. It means then that ultimately a job, be it even your single job, is a social entity and supported by a social system and contributes to that social system. I think this vital piece of information is often left out when we as African people begin to think about the role of education. I think it's almost deliberately projected upon us, this concept of education is merely something for jobs, merely something to enhance social mobility or social status, or to increase wealth, personal wealth. I think we are deliberately not made to see that jobs and roles are a part of protecting a people and advancing the interests of those people. So that ultimately those jobs form a network by which those people defend their interests. And to me, this focuses at the very heart of education and the very point of education. And that is to maintain the survival of a people, to advance the interests of a people, to protect that people against its enemies. Those jobs then that a people perform and those roles that they perform are essential ultimately to maintaining a social system and to maintaining a people and a nation. We then, as African people, must recognize that this is ultimately what our education and the education of our children should be about. We cannot survive as a people if we merely see the jobs we perform and the roles we play as being merely jobs and roles for our own individual enhancement. We must in some way see the roles that we are playing and the jobs we are performing as part of a complex web of roles played by other people. And we must be able then to perform our roles and our jobs in such a way that if there needs be, they can be performed in concert and in a collective way to advance the interests of African people. If we do not see this, then we will be a people of individuals and a people pursuing his or her own individual pathways. And when our enemies then seek to attack us and our enemies seek to destroy us, we will then often find ourselves having difficulty acting on a collective basis and on a collective level. So ultimately, then, beyond viewing the job as an individual situation, we must view it as part of a social system of survival. When we look at, then, jobs, and when we look at education as being functional for our survival as a people, when we see that we must educate our children not merely in terms of enhancing their social mobility and their income, but as a part of saving their very lives, as part of saving our very culture, we must recognize that you can now go to bookstores, Barnes and Nobles and others, and you'll find several volumes, titles of which are similar to this question: can the third world survive? In other words, people are questioning our very ability as African people to survive into the next century. We are concerned then not just about some metaphysical, psychological sense of survival. We're concerned about a biological sense of survival. Will we exist organically as a people, not just psychologically as a people? And yet we are dealing with the people, when we look at their history, are notorious for getting rid of useless people. And and you can run across now questions that begin to ask if African people are of any use in the future world. When we look at our African situation today, we see a continent and we see African people of the world over receding on many levels and not advancing. I constantly talk about the Star Wars example of how we go to movies and things of this nature, and we look right at the world as it is projected before us. And because of our narrow view of things, we often just look at it as entertainment and not as the messages that, and we do not see the messages that are often projected therein. I talked about, of course, the Star Wars series, the series that, particularly in its first rendition, did not even focus on Black people in the world of the future. And often when you hear people discussing the future, the place of African people is not mentioned at all, because often the people who look into their future do not see African people as playing an important role. When you saw that movie, and when you look at that movie, you see a movie that centers around, of course, Star Wars, and we've entered that era. We talk about Reagan and his Star Wars plan. We see a movie there where people are living on artificial planets that they've built and are floating out in space, and they're talking about a future world. We see in that movie perhaps a post-World War III situation where apparently some groups or some people did not manage to escape the planet during that Third World War, and therefore were left to suffer mutations as a result of radiation. When we look in today's real world, we see again then the European people preparing themselves to build these artificial space stations, already exploring planets out, beyond the Earth itself. You see them already developing magazines such as Commercial Space, where they are now talking about how they are going to commercially exploit Mars and commercially exploit the moon, already laying out designs for the future in terms of cities and in terms of other establishments by means of which they will survive on other planets. We see them, of course, with the satellite, with the shuttle program, preparing then to move to other planets and to live under other circumstances. We see them, when they talk about the Star Wars, preparing to fight war in space. And they recognize that the nations who cannot fight war in space will essentially be nations who will have to basically surrender. We see in the current AIDS epidemic the spectra of germ warfare and biological warfare. of how our death may not come upon us from 400 and 500 miles out and rain upon us through the use of exotic weapons such as particle beams or other things of that nature, but may be of the slow, creeping, and agonizing type of, as we see with AIDS. The release of germs and the release of bacteria, the release of devastating crop viruses that will destroy then the very food baskets of people, where they would literally then die as a result thereof. We see, if we look closely at what is going on in the scientific establishment today, nations and people that are concerned with the control of the weather, with a good deal of money and research going into meteorological research, means, and the ultimate means, and the ultimate end being that of literally then trying to control the weather patterns of the earth itself. And the variation of 1 or 2 degrees in the average temperature can have a very devastating effect on crops and other agricultural things on this earth today. This means then that, ladies and gentlemen, those nations who do not appropriately prepare their children and educate their children, those nations and those people who merely see education as a preparation for jobs and as a preparation for individual enhancement and advancement, are going to be those nations that are going to suffer with that individual education. And you're going to have the engineering in your head, and you're going to have the math in your head, and this in your head, and it's not going to save you because the engineering and the math is not organized around some national plan or some social system. It is not enough to have knowledge. It is not enough to have information. It is not enough just to have a job. You must also have a sense of nation and a sense of peopleness, and you must have a sense of place, of where your education and your knowledge and information fits into the whole to save yourself as an individual and to save your people as a collection. Those nations then who merely educate themselves as individuals and who merely educate themselves so that they can move out of the lower class into the middle class, who merely educate themselves so they can receive a gold watch from IBM or some other kind of place or some light promotion, will be those nations and those people who will suffer and die as a result of future events. And therefore, when we talk about the education of our children, that education must be seen within that kind of context. And we will begin then, and this is from where we must start. We see Gorbachev over there now, rearranging the social and political system of Russia. We see the Chinese rearranging their social and political system. And despite all of their doctrinaire attachments to Marx and this and that, they look at reality and recognize that the ultimate point is their survival as a people. And if that calls for throwing Marx aside, they're willing to do that. And now you see a re-examination of their systems of economics, their systems of education. And you will see then when a people such as the United States and such as the Russians and others see themselves as threatened, one of the first things they begin to reorganize is the educational system, because that system is vital to survival. And we then as a people must recognize that. When you look at education then as being vital for survival, for the advancement of your people and the enhancement of your culture, then you get a base for measuring the value of the education you get. Too often we measure education and the goodness of education in terms of the reputation of the school. We look at the Ivy Leagues, and we look at this one and that one, and we look at where all the white folk are. And we assume then that this is where the good education is, you see. And we think then getting degrees from these kind of places represents good education. But you must recognize that good education is a relative term. What is good education today is not good education tomorrow. That education changes its relevance and changes its definition depending upon the circumstances which confronts the people. Ultimately, when you see survival and the advancement of your people as the central focus of education, then you judge education in terms of the degree to which it contributes to the survival and the enhancement of your people. Not in terms of who's teaching and where they're going to school and the reputation of the school. You look at it in terms of to what degree is the education of my child and my people getting going to enhance and ensure the survival of our people. And you recognize often then when you use that criterion that what is called good education may be severe miseducation, may be actually what I have called and have referred to sometimes as an education into ignorance, an education into dumbness. I've said before that if this world is to depend upon African people being unrealistic, being cut off from reality, being ignorant of themselves and of reality, which it does, then education itself will be a process of making us ignorant. In a sense, the more we get, the dumber we become. In reality, yes. Ignorance is a relative thing. Ignorance does not necessarily mean a lack of knowledge. It can mean an abundance of the wrong kind of knowledge. So we cannot look at education merely as an accumulation of knowledge. But education involves not only an accumulation, but a correct kind of knowledge and a knowledge that is usable and functional for a people. While we may go to the Harvard and Yale and accumulate knowledge and accumulate information, there is still question as to whether that accumulated knowledge or information is enough to ensure the survival of African people. While we are learning one thing, we are often not learning another. So in a sense, while we are becoming smart and knowledgeable in one direction, we are becoming dumber and ignorant in another. And often then, the area in which we are becoming more knowledgeable, while it is building up our accumulation of knowledge, may not be relevant to our survival. And we have to look at education in those terms as well, ladies and gentlemen. In what way does education enhance our people? To a good extent, the dominance of the Europeans, who are a minority in the world, depends upon the miseducation of African people, upon a certain kind of ignorance, a certain kind of lack of knowledge and interest. It depends upon that. If this kind of knowledge were available and the kind of social relationships that we need were available, the European would not be in his or her position of dominance today. If that is the case, then it means that even while we are being educated, we are also being made ignorant. It has to be that way. And it's phenomenal then to see how, in a sense, we can be in a classroom and see ourselves as learning and yet at the same time be made ignorant. And often it is the most educated of us who are the most ignorant of what is really going on in the world. Very much so. And it is a pathetic kind of situation because often with this education we assume a certain amount of authority and we often then mislead the people. When you look then at education as a preparation for survival and an enhancement of the people, when you look at education then in terms of its relevance to your people, you begin to see then that the education of black children cannot be a duplicate of the education of white children. It cannot be that. You not only educate a child or people in terms of the available job market, but you also educate them in terms of the future demands that they will face as individuals and as a people. You also educate them in terms of the tasks that lie ahead for them. And therefore, each generation in many instances must achieve a different kind of education from the prior one because it must assume a different kind of task. The task of the current generation is one I do not envy. It's much more complex in many ways, I think, than the older generations. I mean, the older ones, we fought slavery. That was the first thing you had to deal with. And then after that, you fought Jim Crowism, and those things were quite obvious, you know, the black fountain and the white fountain and the colored thing in the back of the bus and this and that, the not voting and job discrimination and those kinds of things which were kind of obvious up front, you know, straightforward. And yet we see generation after generation of our African people rising up to those challenges and dealing with those challenges. We have not overcome them totally by any means, but to a great extent we have subdued them and reduced them. Now we are at another major crossroads, which I think is even more challenging, and that is our very survival into the 21st century. Even while we were slaves, we were needed, you know. And to a great extent, I say maybe up to the 1950s, we were still pretty much a needed part of this culture because we perform certain roles. But when you look at the futurists who talk about automation and various other kinds of things, as I said earlier, the need for such a large amount of us becomes questionable. And then the issue becomes, what are we going to do with those people? This then means that this generation, at this point, faces a very severe challenge. Because as I said earlier, when we look at the history of the Europeans, we see a history of a people who, by one means or another, have eliminated people they no longer need economically. And I do not believe that this trait has disappeared by any means. In fact, when we look at our situation today, ladies and gentlemen, we're in very precarious circumstances. I've often said that if the Europeans decided that they would re-enslave African people or decide that they would just remove African people from this globe, from the continent, what African nation could actually defend the interests of black people? How would we defend our interests as people? We have been misled by assimilationists and integrationists who make us think that once we unite with these people and they overlook our color and so forth, we will have, become free at last. But that's an illusion. You cannot put your fate in the hands of the so-called goodwill of the people you know from their historical and from their current behavior have no goodwill, and who are subject to change that will dependent upon economic, social, and political circumstances. No matter how well you are employed and no matter how well you are integrated, no matter how well you are worked and assimilated into the American and European structure, that is no guarantee against your ultimate elimination, ladies and gentlemen. The ultimate guarantee cannot rest in the hands of Europeans. It must rest in your own hands. You must be in a position to defend your own lives and your own selves as people. That requires an assumption of power, not of getting somebody to love you or getting someone to so-called accept you, or getting someone to look at you and overlook your color and see you as some kind of abstraction. It requires the ability to actually defend yourself regardless of the attitude of the other individual. Your salvation and our salvation cannot rest in the laws of this country. It cannot rest in the cardinal principles of white Christianity. They must ultimately rest in our ability to defend ourselves against our enemies. Because the law cannot protect anyone. The law is only as strong as those who wish to enforce the law. And so the laws that are on the books now are no protection for us, ladies and gentlemen, as long as those laws depend upon the enforcement by our enemies. And if they should, for whatever reason, decide that they will not enforce those laws, then we are back to square one, if not in worse shape. This means then that we must not only struggle, so-called, for acceptance, but we must struggle for true and real power. When we talk about then power, then we are talking about educating the black child and educating ourselves in a very different fashion than what it is today. I usually enumerate some reasons why we should have a black psychology, the developmental psychology of the black child. One of the things that I mentioned is that the destiny of the black child is not that of the European child. When we look this world over and we see many of our African nations on the continent and off the continent stagnating economically, socially, and politically and militarily, when we see our own condition in this country stagnating and going backwards and our communities crumbling and falling apart as a result of crack and all other kinds of ailments, when we look at our TVs and see the face of poverty as that of a black child, bloated stomach, we must recognize that the task of our children is fundamentally different from the ones of the prior generations. When we look, as I mentioned earlier, at nations getting ready now to move out into the universe and to claim other planets and the resources of those planets, and we look at our own situations yet struggling to build a scientific establishment, when we look at our situations where our communities are not owned at all, economically or politically by ourselves, we must recognize then that the education that is given to the white child is not an appropriate education for black children. And the way we rear black children cannot be a duplicate of the rearing of the white child. I have often stated then that the destiny of the white child is conservative. It is to conserve and enhance the advantages that the whites and Europeans already have. This is at the very center. So you'll hear them talk about maintaining our lead over Japan, maintaining our lead over Russia, maintaining the gap over this nation or that nation as such. That's not our problem. That's not our problem, ladies and gentlemen. The destiny of the black child, I've often said, is what? Revolutionary. Revolutionary. If we are to feed these children, if Africa is to reclaim its wealth and keep and remove itself from being raped and pillaged by Europeans, if we are to change the situation of where our peoples who inhabit the wealthiest lands upon this earth are literally starving to death over these lands, and while other people's lands who have nothing are seen as rich and powerful, then we're talking about preparing the black child for revolution. We are talking about changing and turning this current system upside down, right side up, and changing the circumstances under which we live. That requires a very fundamentally different kind of education. In other words, the education of black children and the education of the black man is an education for war. It isn't, thank you very much, it's an education for revolution, for overthrowing the current system. We must face that fact and face those circumstances. When you talk about war and when you talk about revolution, you're not only then talking about education in terms of knowledge, but education in terms of character, education in terms of identity. You're talking about establishing new social relations between people, new types of identities and ways of looking at the world and looking at oneself. That is not an education that can be achieved in an integrated, assimilated classroom. It is an education that can be achieved only by a philosophy. We must then prepare to bring into this earth and bring onto this earth and into this world a new world order. I've often stated that it is not enough for us just to talk about integrating into a system. I think it's a shame that we did not discuss the whole issue of integration in the 40s and 50s and discuss whether this was the kind of system we wanted to integrate into. We did not discuss its moral, social aspects. We merely saw ourselves as being left out. But we did not ask ourselves, left out of what? If we are talking about a system that is racist in its very core, that is exploitative, that threatens the very life of mankind itself, that is morally and spiritually decadent, then the issue should not be whether we are going to integrate into it or not, but the issue is to bringing into being a new world order and a new social system. African people then are not merely concerned about being integrated into a social system, but bringing into being a new way of living and a new way of relating to mankind on this earth. a new set of values, a new set of orientations, another kind of spirituality and morality that does not threaten life on earth and destroy and exploit and eat people up and degrade people who are different from themselves. Again, then, when we talk about the education, we recognize that the education as it is presently presented in the schools today is not adequate for the education of our children and of our people. When we look at this situation here in Newark and in these other cities, we should not just be preparing our children and ourselves to work for Prudential and for some of the others in here now that are getting ready to direct the destiny of this city, but to actually compete and overcome and take over those systems. To take over the city, not just to get a mayor elected and get one or two guys and one or two women or something to stand as a symbol when all the rest of us are starving and scratching, trying to make a living. We need to elect people more than just for inspiration, than just for models and so forth. That's good for the moment, but it doesn't help out in the long run. We cannot just continue to live vicariously, living through the success of one other individual or one other person. We must be about the actual physical, economic, and social takeover of this town. If you're the majority in it and a part of a large majority in it or a large minority in it, you should be represented in it in a total sort of way and in a way of power, not just in terms of some kind of tokenism and window dressing. This, though, the establishment is not prepared to give you. It is going to have to be taken. It is going to have to be ripped from their claws, sometimes psychologically and often physically. This is what it's about. And if we are to survive, we have to prepare our children to do it. Unfortunately, this is a part of the destiny that we have to face ourselves for. It is time for us to control these cities that we inhabit and to use their resources for our advancement. You look at the Board of Education, since we're talking about education, say in New York City, that spends something like $6 billion, a tremendous amount of money. I've often said that if I could just sell the chalk to the Board of Education, I'd be rich. If I could just sell the yellow pencils, the number 2 pencils to the system, just the blackboards, the desks, the chairs, and that's the light stuff. What about the construction of the schools? What about being the custodian who gets something like $250,000 or more dollars to spend the way he or she wants to? What about all of the other things that go into the running of an educational system? Billions and billions of dollars. Not only then are those dollars used to miseducate our people, but they are used to enrich another people. You can make many millionaires for $6 billion, I tell you. You can make many wealthy people using that kind of wealth. But if you're not in a position of power, you see, if you're only concerned with getting a chancellor up there to serve as a symbol, but all of the other monies that are being spent in various other ways are still going to the other people, you've accomplished very little, if anything at all. You must recognize that in this nation and in this world, money, wealth, and politics are intricately welded together. You see? And they go together. And if we are to get access to economic power as well as political power, we must then seek to take over the cities and our areas economically and politically. We must see the Board of Education not merely as a mean of educating, which it is not doing, but also as an industry and as a resource for our people. But we have to see it that way. But if we're not educated to see it that way, if we go into civics classes where we are miseducated and we're given an unrealistic idea of how the city is actually run, of what actually happens, even though those of us who get educated in these systems will be of little or no value. I've often remarked about 125th Street, with which, of course, I'm familiar, of how there must be almost a monotonic a direct relationship between the number of degrees in business administration we get and the fewer businesses we actually administer. In other words, at the same time we are getting an increasing number of degrees in business administration, other people are coming into the community and managing the businesses. In other words, we have not seen yet an outflow from the colleges that are providing the degrees in business and economics. In other words, we have not seen yet an outflow from the colleges that are providing the degrees in business and economics into our communities in any concrete sort of way. It almost seems to be going in the other direction, which means then that the degrees that we are receiving in these colleges and institutions are not degrees designed to advance and enhance the economic, social, and political development of our communities, but are degrees for servants. That no matter how high we go in achieving these degrees, the essential constant remains. That constant being we are educated to serve the interests of another people and to work against our own. So again, it is not enough to get the degrees merely to have them, but those degrees, a part of getting those degrees must be one where we can come and use them for our own interests and for our own people. So when we look at education then in terms of enhancing the advancement of African people, we must recognize that we are the ones who must take up the chief responsibility for the education of our children. That we are preparing our children for revolution. We are preparing our children to ensure the survival of our people and to ensure their own survival as a people. That we are preparing our children to bring onto this earth and into being a new way of living and a new world order. It means then that we must educate our children in a way that's relevant to those goals and relevant to ourselves. We must not look upon the educational approaches of other people as representing quote unquote standard education. And this is one of the problems that we run into constantly. We permit the European to call his or her ethnic practices standard practices. You see, and they assume then a pattern of being universal, non-racial. I've gotten into trouble in my classes because in a developmental psych class, I decided to teach about the psychology of Black and Hispanic children. And yet I had a person who belonged to that group to complain to the white man about my teaching. Well, she thought it was a narrow course. I want to know about all people. Of course, all people being white folk. You see. Somehow white folk being somehow more universal. You know, you've gotten this thing, if you write about Black people, if you focus on Black people, somehow you're narrow. You know, it's parochial. But if it's white or if the ethnicity is not identifiable, then it's universal, you see. And yet I had to call to her attention and to the attention of the others there that you have a system here that is now approaching 80% Black and Hispanic in the educational system of New York City. And if you're working with children, particularly in this area, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be working with Black and Hispanic children. If you look at the world, you're going to see at least 90% of this world is of people of color. So how is it that if I teach you the psychology of people of color, you seem to think that this is some kind of narrow psychology? Actually, a more universal psychology would be the teaching of the psychology of people of color, not the other way around. But we have been psyched into thinking that if we talk white and teach white, somehow we're being more universal. Yet it is really a becoming ignorant and being made ignorant because we are not learning about the people who are most vital to us, and that's, of course, ourselves as people. And so you get courses in college that are not called the developmental psychology of the white child, the developmental psychology of the white child. It's just called what? Developmental psychology. You know? And not the economics of white folks and Western Europeans. What is it? Economics, you know, and so we've permitted the European to usurp the titles. And I've told you one of the things that we have to do as people is take away from the European the power of definition, of being able to name things. The power to name, the power to name, the power to define is an immense power. It is essentially then a power to control and to create consciousness. You see in Genesis, as God hands over the power to Adam, one of the means by which he hands over that power is what? You shall what? Name and classify. And when you permit another people to name and classify, you're then a subordinate to that people. As a matter of fact, I'm sure some of you saw the Gil Noble show today. And one aspect of that show was very, very interesting. I forget which one it was. I believe it might have been Tatum, but it might have been the other one, Cooper, who indicated that if it isn't in the New York Times, it doesn't what? It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. A very important fact mentioned there, ladies and gentlemen. You know, I talk about various constants. That is, various things that have not changed despite all of the apparent changes we've gone through. I talked in other forums about how certain things have remained the same, despite now riding the front of the bus and eating at the same lunch counter and going to, the same jobs and getting promoted and getting on the Supreme Court and all of these other things. But there are certain things that have remained fundamentally the same, and there's no intention for the European to ever change them. As a matter of fact, the changes have been instituted to maintain the sameness, to obscure and blind one to the constants. As a matter of fact, I've often told my students you are being educated to put a black face on white power. Integrationism and assimilationism, to me, to a good extent, is merely an outgrowth of neocolonialism, where there is an apparent change in power, an apparent change in who's in control, but the real power and the real control is still in the same hand. And we still have that kind of game going on. And a good deal of education today is about that kind of deception. I've often indicated, in fact, for the European to rule this world, they have to rule it in terms of what? Lies and deception. There's no other way it can be done. When you have a minority that's hardly 10% of the world's population ruling over another 90%, that minority has to lie, it has to deceive, it has to control consciousness. That's the only way it can be done, ladies and gentlemen. As I've so often stated then, in order for us to be in the position we're in, we literally what? Have to be out of our minds. And we have to. And we have to believe lies. The coup that was pulled by the City Sun was a major one, a very major step forward, and a momentous one today. Because beyond the story itself was a much more fundamental thing happening, a very revolutionary thing happening. Or as one of the gentlemen said, if it's not in the Times, it's not news. That's one of the constants I talk about. What I call the constant of maintaining power over definition. And I've said, despite the change, despite the fact now we're not in slavery, despite all these other things I named earlier, the European still maintains control over what? Information. He still maintains control over definition, maintains control over what is to be called news and what is not news, maintains control over what I refer to as the domain of discourse. That means what is worth talking about and that which is not worth talking about, what is worth knowing and that which is not worth knowing, you see. And often because we are dependent upon these people, our consciousness is shaped by them. And often then because we believe what they call as news is only news and what they do not call as news is not news, then again, we're mentally shaped and directed by these people. The coup of the City Sun then, I think, helps to remove that constant, which we must remove as a people. And that is of seeing Europeans as the ultimate source and validators of truth. And seeing Europeans as the ultimate source and the validators of authority. And going to them as the final authorities in this world. Hopefully, this incident will mean that we will begin to look within ourselves as people as the basis for truth and the basis for authority. This is one of the things that is frightening now the news establishment and frightening the whole establishment. That is that black people will begin to see themselves as sources of truth and sources of definition and sources of authority. Because once you start seeing yourself that way, you're laying the basis and foundation for revolution and overthrow. You have moved a long way toward down the road of true independence. Because being independent, you must have an independence of thought and mind and character and outlook. You cannot be an independent people and be validated only through and by the means of another people. So this has been great. I see a part of the drug struggle in our country also as one built around this issue of authority. To a good extent, we as a people can remove the scourge of drugs if we would assume the authority over our communities. But because we've let another people believe that they're the only ones who can make laws, they're the only one who can make rules concerning social conduct, that any other people who are not executing the laws are thereby vigilantes, that any other people who are executing the laws other than themselves are vigilantes, that no other people on this earth have a right to make rules and regulations and control their life circumstances, you see, are therefore wrong. When we fall into those beliefs, that we do not have a right as a people to protect our children and to protect our communities, we are going to be destroyed. It means, though, that if we are to protect our communities and save our communities from the destruction that they're now facing, we are going to have to assume authority in our communities. The problem then with the drug situation, to a good extent, and it's not the total problem, but to a good extent, is that this European community does not turn over authority to the black community. It would rather see our communities destroyed and eaten up by drugs than to see a bunch of black men and women get out here and decide that they're going to run these dealers off the street. You have to sit around and watch your children and our children be destroyed and fall under addiction because we feel as if we don't have the authority to go out and remove people who are destroying them. But when you're educated by another people, you see, when you fall under and we fall under the rulership of another people and we assume that they are the ultimate authorities and validators of truth, this is the consequence. Destruction of ourselves and of us as a people. And this is what's happening to us. When you do not educate your children to take authority, because revolution cannot be, by definition, what? Legitimate. You don't create revolution by obeying the law. No. I'm listening. You create revolution by being illegal and going outside, quote unquote, the law. If it then takes our going outside of the law to protect the advancement of our people, then by all means we must do that. And by all means we must prepare our children to do that. But when you're being educated by the other people, they're going to make you think that obeying the law is the ultimate end of all. And when they tell you you can only progress by keeping your nose clean in terms of the law, in a sense they are holding you then under their own control. So again, the education of our children represents a preparation for revolution and war, and ultimately a means of saving our own people. With that in mind, then, how do we tailor education? What kind of milestones or markers should we sort of look for or lay down in terms of educating our children? What is the problem with the current educational system? To a good extent, you see, when you start talking about the education of our children and our people, you have to look at this racist system. So a lot of people start right off with educational technique. You know, how do you teach the ABCs? How do you teach math? How do you teach this? As if the problem of teaching our children is merely one of technique and not one of political struggle and social struggle. It's merely one where a child comes in with an empty head and you just pour knowledge into it and just leave it at that. But education is not that simple at all, ladies and gentlemen. That is not what it is about necessarily. You have to ask yourself the question when you begin to look at the education of our children, just what would happen if our children, if we graduated, say, 80, 90% or more of our children in a way that they could successfully compete with the other groups in the system. Is there room enough economically in the economic system of Newark for a large number of educated blacks and other people of color? Is there enough room in the economy to absorb a large group of our people? Particularly in terms of being fully in control of that system. I'm not talking about just on entry-level jobs, but from top to bottom. You have to ask yourself that kind of question. We asked about New York. Does the dropout rate then really represent, on top of everything else, a political means by which our people are taken out of economic competition? Does it provide an easy excuse and cover over what would ultimately be racism, but now can be hidden behind lack of education? Oh, so, you don't get these jobs and you don't get this or that because your people are not being educated. If not, why is it that successful black educational institutions seem so frightening to the other people in the world? Ask yourself the question, what would really happen if we truly educated our children and our people in the way that I've been talking about earlier? What does that really represent to European power and to European dominance in the world? And then ask yourself if these people are really sincere about educating their children in the right sort of way. You see, this country has a dilemma. it projects itself as a liberal, progressive society. And yet at the same time, it must maintain a large segment of that society in subordination. But it must not say, it must though say, we're not doing it in terms of racism. It's done because of some defect within those people themselves. It reminds you again of the Malcolm X situation here, where he talks about, what is it, the man, you break his legs and then you tell him he's free to run in the race. This is the situation where they say, well, you're free to go to any school you want to, but your mental legs have been broken. Now, if you can't win, that's your problem. And this is what happens in a society that operates on the basis of a contradiction, that appears to be liberal and open and has laws about integrationism and has a court that rules against segregation and so forth, but yet at the same time has a need to maintain a large segment of its population in ignorance and in a low level economically and socially and politically speaking. It, in a sense, must break the mental legs of the people and then say you have opportunity if you would only take advantage of it. And therefore, it maintains itself and maintains its power while it appears to be free and appears to be open and appears to provide opportunity for the people. You ask yourself then, if this system is truly concerned with the education of black children. And the other question is, of course, would we really want our children to be educated in the way that it educates them if it were truly concerned? That's still another issue. You see, because if miseducation is going on, even being truly concerned and caring and successful, quote unquote, may still not add to the enhancement of our people and advancement of our people. There's still another issue there. In a sense, then, this system accomplishes its means by one or two ways. I think I saw Kenneth Clark railing the other day in the paper there when they were debating this issue, so whether black children think differently from white children. Some of you might have seen a couple of those pieces. And of course, people get really riled up right away. We get riled up immediately. Anything that suggests that we're different from another people upsets us right away, because we assume that differentness automatically means inferiority, And if you say we think differently from the white child, oh, no. We think just like them. All they need to do is just be, all they need to do is to just be taught. All they need to do is just receive a solid education and caring education by the people who are in control of the schools. It's sort of the Kenneth Clark idea. Can black children be educated in those terms? Yes, they can be educated in those terms. You can motivate black children to be educated in the system in a way, the way it is, in a way, ideally. But what would be the end point of it? You see, you have two basic fundamental ways that this system maintains black people, the educational system maintains black people under control. The large percentage of them, of course, it just sort of grinds out as we move through the gradation system. And it sort of just feeds the class structure, you see. The other, and a large part of it involves the dropping out situation, or where people just literally quituate and just leave it. The other part, though, involves people who actually become, quote unquote, educated in it. But education at the price of alienation. Education at the price of being cut off from cultural roots and cut off from one's sense of peopleness. Educated at the price of becoming an abstraction. Just a human being, just a man, no longer black and African. Just a professional, who now define themselves in terms of the rules and regulations of the job. You see, but not in terms of the peopleness at all, or in terms of an African identity. And so we get then people who are educated, but who in the process of being educated are literally, in a sense, educated out of their minds and educated out of their identity and educated into technocratism. They're able then to repair computers and all the rest of the things, but they cannot do it within an Afrocentric context and cannot do it for African people. They can manage businesses by objectives. And they can train and educate other people to run businesses, but they cannot develop businesses within their own communities. In other words, when you're educated in alienation, you can only serve whom? Aliens. That's the only ones you can serve. And therefore, Those of us who get educated in these current systems also run the danger then of being alienated at the same time, of creating a schism within our personalities, of losing the ability to use our education for the advancement of our own people, of sometimes even sinking into neurotic self-hatred and conflict, so that we are literally paralyzed in our ability to actually advance the interests of our people. Being educated in this system then often requires that we give up our sense of peopleness and acquire the values and outlook of another people. And in a sense then we become black white folk, or white folk with black skin. You still do not have true integration in this kind of system, but you have black white men and black white women intermixing with white men and white women. Because integration, and true integration, would mean that you're bringing in a true African perspective to the table and a different set of values and cultural orientation, not people who've been made over. So often the educational process here is one of being educated then into alienation. Now let us see then how we would tailor this education to our children. When you talk about educating a child, you must have some sense of the developmental psychology of that child. It's very important. One of the reasons why our children are miseducated is that the educational psychology and the educational approach that is used in the educational system is based upon the psychology of the European child. The black child, as I've often said before, is not a child who happens to be black, as if some curse had fallen upon it. That our Africanness represents more than color, has a long and beautiful history behind it, and that each black child contains in its body and in its genes a capsulated form of all of the history and experiences of black people. The experiences of our people, of African people, is represented in our very bodies and in our very minds, ladies and gentlemen. We not only have an individual consciousness and unconsciousness, we also have a collective consciousness and unconsciousness. Even though the current generation of children may not have been born in slavery, the experience of slavery as a black people is still represented in them today. They therefore cannot escape the slave heritage merely by feigning ignorance of it or seeking to escape it. It is still there. It is a part of the psychology of our children. And we ignore that history of our people at our peril. That is not the psychology of the white child. It's not a part of that psychology. When you look at the psychology of the black child, those of you who've read the book, The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, you see that even physiologically our children develop in ways that are significantly different than in advance of the white child. That you cannot use the nutritional chart that is used to feed the bodies of white children to adequately meet the nutritional needs of black children. That the brains of our children are developing in advance of that of white. They walk and they talk early and they do many other things early. You're talking about a children who represent the origin of mankind upon this earth, not children who are just black. Children whose ethnic groups is the mother and father of all other ethnic groups on this earth. Children whose ancestors laid the very foundation of what it means to be human on this earth, ladies and gentlemen. And I believe when you see them in advance in their development and in their coordination and in their mental abilities, it sort of recapitulates the advancement of our people in the history of mankind as a whole. As we were the first of humankind to walk upon this earth and to engage in social relations and political development and all of the other things, we see it represented again in our children as they walk and talk earlier and relate earlier and move about on this earth earlier. So we are talking about then a child who then is not a colored imitation of the European child. We talk about then the psychology of the individual as being a representative of the history and experience of that individual. You are who you are as an individual to a great extent as a result of your personal history. And therefore, to understand you as an individual, a person must have some sense of your experience and your history as an individual. because that is the basis and foundation of your psychology, of your outlook and your orientation to life. And therefore, when you look at a people, in order to understand the psychology of that people, you must also understand the history and experience of that people. If you do not understand the history and experience of that people, you do not understand the psychology of that people. And if you then you seek then to educate the people and the children of those people and relate to those people, you are going to miseducate them and misrelate to them, and you're going to distort their psychology, and you're going to distort them as people. When then you have your children being taught by teachers and by people who are not familiar with your history and experience as a people, and who are therefore not familiar with your psychology, when you are being taught by people who are not familiar with the tasks that I mentioned earlier that must be performed by your current generation, when you're being taught by people who are not familiar with the destiny that you have as a people, your children then will be miseducated. They will be mislabeled. They will be given false labels and called deficient and all of the other negative names we so often hear about our children. When you establish then an educational system, you must have some kind of intuitive or at least clear knowledge of the psychology, the developmental psychology of the children you're teaching and of the people you're teaching. When you talk about when you're going to teach them to read, or when you're going to teach writing, or when you're going to teach math, or when you're going to teach this subject or that subject, that assumes that you have some sense of the child's psychological and physiological readiness before you move into teaching various areas. And different areas and different people, because of different biological, social, and political and psychological histories, will achieve readinesses at different times. And therefore, you cannot operate on the basis of something called a standard education. There's no such thing as a standard education. You have to remove this idea. You got to get rid of the concept of equal education, of the same education. Those are empty terms and have no meaning whatsoever. They're going to misguide you. As I've stated before, and some of you have heard me on the Gary Birch, who told us that all children must learn the same thing at the same time? Why do you submit yourself to these standardized tests? Who told you that your children had to know the same thing at the same time as some white child across town, and that if he didn't make this score at this point in his psychological growth or physical growth, he's somehow what? Deficient and in need of remediation and in need of holding back? That is a dastardly assumption, and it's an arrogant, racist assumption. Do I mean then that they have to be behind some other group of people? I don't mean that at all. It may mean that they have to be what? Ahead. But what I mean most of all is that how they're tested and how they're evaluated should be relevant to their psychology and their history and experience as people and where we want to go as people, and that's not coterminous with other people. We must not be afraid to be different, to define ourselves in terms of ourselves. We talk about the black family, and I've often warned people, we can define the black family the way what? We feel like it. The European family is not a divine, God-sent family. And simply because the African family does not resemble that family doesn't mean it necessarily has to be called broken or this or that. There are many ways you can define a family. We have a right to redefine and restructure our family dependent upon the way we want to go as people. It does not have to fit another people's definition of what a family is about. But when you fall for that, then you get into feeling guilty, ashamed, and all of the other kind of things we begin to feel, and that is infused into our children, and it psychs them out and continues to create a vicious cycle that destroys us as a people. We have to take over the power of definition. But we often are not facing this. And the education of your children and of yourselves would imbue in your children and ourselves this kind of sense of control, that we have a right to define and to do things in terms of our interest. So in a sense then, in order for this educational system to appropriately educate our children, the educational system then must have a knowledge of the developmental psychology of African children. And the educational curricula must be based upon that knowledge, not upon that of the white child. You have a system here then where you've inherited an educational system set up by other people for whom? For their children. You see? And what has happened then, you've force-fed and pushed your children into these structures, psychologically and otherwise. And now you become shocked as to why they do not succeed in these very systems that have been set up for the interests of other people. In a sense, our children are smarter than we are in a way because they know that there's something wrong, fundamentally wrong with this kind of thing. That they're being misshapen, that they're being forced outside of themselves, that they're being alienated. They may be not able to articulate it in psychological and other sociological terms, but it's felt in the heart, and the resistance comes out in one way or the other. But that resistance, instead of being looked upon as a cause for examination and analysis and for change of the system, is looked upon as a basis for labeling the children as suffering from learning deficiencies and other kind of disabilities. And this is the kind of excuse that we have around here. That's right. And the kind of games that are going on. And too many of us, even the so-called educated blacks, buy these definitions. I was listening the other night to Barry Farber, and I just took a minute, that's like listening to Bob Grant, right? and I caught him just for a second because I can't deal with him any longer than that. And I turned to the station just at the point where he said, "Oh, I wish Roy Ennis were here." He was talking to Ishmael Reed at that time, of course, and of course he and Bob really wished that Roy were there, when it comes to lambasting black people. And he says, "Oh, Ishmael, wouldn't you agree that black people produce the bulk of the crime? You would have to admit that, wouldn't you?" A very interesting kind of question. And one that you see even produced by people like the Mouth. What's his name? Morton Down. Same kind of thing. You must admit that your people are creating the crimes, and when it comes to mugging and to this and to that, that they must be doing the majority of the crime. It's an interesting issue again. And unfortunately, I see many of our people not dealing with that issue. And of course, because we read white statistics, we really get caught up in it. Because when you say, well, percentage-wise, that may be true, But is it? What's even more fundamental than that question? Who is in control of defining what crime is? You see, let's look at that first. Because your definition of crime may not be necessarily what? My definition of crime. And is it that you define crime in such a way that you decriminalize your own people and criminalize another people? As I've stated in another context, the European system needs black criminality. That a part of the process is for us to be viewed as criminals. I've stated before that if people see you as a criminal just by looking at you, then it means they have a need, psychological need within themselves to perceive you as that way. If whites then suspect every black man of being a criminal, then it must be that they need to see every black man in that light. And that need then must serve some psychological, political, social interest that they have as people. And we don't have time to go into it yet, but that's where it starts from. If we do not view slavery and enslavement of our people as the ultimate crime, the discrimination against our people and the destruction and exploitation of our people as the ultimate crime, then we will fall for those kind of questions. If we do not see the so-called criminality of black people as a punishment, ultimately, for the so-called criminality of white people, if we do not see the so-called criminality of black people as a punishment, ultimately, for the so-called criminality of white people, we'll fall for that kind of question. The idea is to understand where this stuff comes from. So when we look at the education of our children, then we must understand the psychology and the history and experience of our children. Let's look at another instance. The schools then that we have inherited are schools that were designed to educate another people, another children, to meet other demands and tasks that are relevant to them. Therefore, being educated in these systems then necessarily miseducates our own children, whether they're quote unquote successful in the schools or what? Unsuccessful in the school. There is a lack of continuity between what is going on in the school and what goes on in the culture. In the cultures that are self-determining, there is an organic relationship between what is called education and what is going on in the culture as a whole. There's a wholeness there because the educational structure is created out of a cultural need, out of an attempt of a culture to adapt itself to certain demands. So there's a type of wholeness and continuity there. But when you have an educational structure imposed from the outside to meet the needs of people from the outside, to meet their needs, then the educational structure is discontinuous and disconnected to your own culture and to your own people. And therefore, your child walks into an educational system that is foreign to it and that is disconnected from his whole life experience. And then his life experience is looked upon as something worthless and valueless, as upon something that needs of correction and in need of remediation and restructuring. And therefore we get this whole system of special ed and all this other kind of nonsense that we have out here today. Because people refuse to look at the psychology and understand the psychology of our people. 40% of the New York City teachers are going to be retiring here very shortly. They're going to have to hire 30,000 new teachers. That's a vast opportunity for us, ladies and gentlemen, if we would take advantage of it and move into these systems and educate our children. It is time for a changing of the guard and put in, as teachers of those children, the people who belong to the ethnic groups of those children. And where that is not the case, where at least we are able to input and influence the educational system. When you say, for instance, let's look at the time situation. Many of us think, for instance, that white children speak so-called better English because they have what? Better teachers. You know, we assume that. And yet it has nothing to do with that at all. Very little to do with that. The child comes to school speaking a language that is quite adequate within its own context. And now what we often require is that that child changes that language habit and switch over to a new language and a new way of speaking and so forth. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, it is basically more difficult for a person who speaks a so-called dialect of English to speak the standard English than it is for a person who speaks a total foreign language to come in and often get up the new language. We often think because black children speak a so-called English that's similar to the standard English, it should be easy for them to move from that English into the so-called standard English. Actually, it makes it often more difficult because sometimes it's much more difficult to tell the difference, you see, between the two. And you can't understand why is the teacher saying Carolina when I'm saying Carolina? Right. You know, you don't hear the what roll, you know, and you know, you not only speak in what in dialects, we often what hear in them, and often we people are saying things we just don't hear it even because we are not what listening for it. It's not enough to have good ears and good hearing. You must also have what good listening faculties as well, you see. And therefore, what's happening here? Often then, if we talk about sane education, which for many people means having the black child in the classroom for the same amount of time, for the same amount of instruction as the white child. We call that what? Same education and equal education. But recognize what you're doing here. One goes into the school where the language is already a language that he what? Speaks. That is continuous pretty much with the language he already has. His mothers and fathers are the one running the school. And so he's a part of it. So he may have to fine tune it a little bit. And yet we say we're giving the black child an equal education when we put him in what? The class at the same what? The same time unit and the same fourth and tell him you got to make the same grades as the other one. Now, two things got to happen in that situation. Either the child has got to learn, let us say, twice as fast in the same unit of time, or else if you don't expand the time and readjust the time, then the child is seen as what? Deficient and falling behind. You see? And this is often what happens. You must recognize that a culture is not only a way of living and a way of relating, it has a time dimension related to it. And therefore, if you're educating your children, you must think in terms of the time requirements that are there as well. Now, when I see in my psychology classes, black students coming in, African students coming in, the thing that I regret often is not that they have disabilities or inabilities, is that I don't have enough what? Time. If you're going to tell me that they are half as far, if you want to use that term, as is the white student, then why don't I have what? Twice the time. But what you're telling me is they're half as advanced, but you still have what? The same unit of time. And therefore, you're saying you're giving them what? An equal education. And therefore, if they don't arise to standards, there's something wrong with them. They need remediation and restructuring in some sort of way. Yes. No, but when you get to know the psychology, when you get children then who are wrestling with self-concept problems, with identity problems, with motivational problems, and all of the other kind of issues we talk about in the black community, you must recognize then it may take a year or two of that early time just getting them set up, what? Psychologically to undergo the educational process. But because little white Johnny is starting at this point, who does not have the what? The same psychological issues and things to settle. And little black Johnny is at the same age, we assume because he's not there with white Johnny, there's something wrong. I've said, who said that there's such thing as 7th grade math? What is 7th grade math? What is 10th grade math? I mean, is there some universal metaphysical thing called 10th grade math? No, it's math you may teach at a particular time, but there's no law that says it has to be what? Taught at that time. And then if the person is not taught it at that time, quote unquote, they're retarded or backwards or something like that. There's no rule that says that at all. But we assume that right away. We assume that because of the other people, because we do not define ourselves. If it may be that we may decide to teach our children their first math in the 3rd grade or the 4th grade or the 5th grade. You say, that's kind of late, isn't it? Not necessarily. If children have been psychologically distorted and are psychologically confused and are suffering from the abuse of this racist system, maybe the first few years should be built around dealing with this and healing these kind of wounds. Once those wounds are healed and once the purpose and sense of purpose is given, that child can learn often 2 and 3 grades of math in 1 year. See what I'm saying? So simply because little white Johnny is taking it at grade 2 and yours is not, does not necessarily mean that your child is going to come from behind. It may mean, though, if you try to teach him that, along with all the other struggles he's undergoing, he's assured of coming out behind. And therefore, an educational structure must be one that takes that into consideration, that we as African people will. And therefore, an educational structure must be one that takes that into consideration, that we as African people will time the education of our children relevant to our own social system and time dimension. So then, to short it here, we have to look then at the history and experience of people. We have to change the level of expectations concerning our children. The intention of this world is to maintain black people in servitude. There's been no intention to change that at all. Now, you may be a presidential servant if you want to, a vice presidential servant, or a neo-colonial African leader servant. You're still servant just the same. And to create and to build that servitude requires a creating of character. The beauty of the system is, how do I create a people for servitude and yet not let them be aware that they're being created for that purpose? And you have this kind of system. We must recognize that the essence of this system has been one of trying to create a character in black people. It's not that we have just missed out on being educated or this or that. It's the fact that this system has actually and still seeks to create a character in us as people. a character that maintains itself regardless of level of education. In other words, you can be a servant with a PhD as much as you can be a servant without one. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The constant in there is what? Servitude and serving another people's interests. And to really make this servitude work efficiently, you must make the person think that what he is doing flows from inside of himself. And you can see this wish for servitude in books like Huxley's, A Brave New World, right? Or B.F. Skinner's, Walden 2. And you can see it in various science fiction sometimes where people are created from the cradle to serve particular functions and will be happy with that function because they've been taught no other function. This is not just a futuristic fantasy on the part of certain writers. It is an essential part of the social system. The idea here then is to create a mentality in people. The black man in this world today is a created man. We are, as I've stated in another context, a Frankenstein people. A people created to serve the needs and purposes of another people. One of the reasons and one of the goals of becoming liberated is that of becoming self-creating, of being in control of determining our own personality and social structure. You must recognize then that in order to, as I said earlier, for this minority to rule the world, the majority must have in it a certain character that submits to this rulership and this servitude. And it must be done, in a sense, almost voluntarily and with gladness. With a sense of this is the right way the world should be organized. Because otherwise, this majority would not submit to this kind of rulership. It means then that the education system must be about creating this kind of character. I've stated then, if you want to know the character of the black child at any point in history, particularly under oppression and under European domination, you merely ask yourself what character in the African child is necessary for the maintenance of that domination. What kind of mental, political, and social characteristics must these children have if the white European is to stay in power? And you will see then those characteristics being created. Or ask it the other way. What characteristics in the African personality and in the minds of African children, which if they existed there would be perceived as threats to European domination? And you will see those characteristics being what? Neutralized and washed out. And from that, when you start with that question, you can begin to see the system organized economically, politically, educationally, and in every way to create those characteristics or to neutralize those other characteristics which work against European interests. Once you see that, then you can see the basis of your curricular approach. If, for instance, thinking black people who are able to look beyond the obvious, black people who are able to think abstractly as well as pragmatically, who are able to think technologically, but not only think technologically, but actually organize themselves technologically to produce technological instruments and technological systems. If that kind of thinking is a threat to European people, you will see your children having problems in science in the schools, ladies and gentlemen. You will see them having problems in what? Mathematics. And therefore, they're having problems in science and mathematics is not just a happenstance, it is a necessary problem for maintaining European dominance. And that's what it's about. If the love of African people, one from the other, if we can look beyond these names that white people have put up on us and see ourselves as one African people, is a threat to European dominance, then you will see us identifying ourselves in terms of these European given names. I'm West Indian, I'm Bahamian, I'm Afro-American, I'm this, and using those as what? As the basis and foundation for not coming together and organizing as a people, you see? In fact, you heard, I believe, on LIB the other day, I think the United States is now getting ready to put in a new racial category in the census called mixed. That's going to give a lot of Negroes a way out. Yeah. So they're going to bring into being a mixed race. So in the future, you can check off mixed. You know, check your little color out and do the mixed number. A South Africanization, this is the thing I've had to tell people for years and years, that race is not only a biological term, a genetic term, it is also a sociological term. And to a great extent, it's more important sociologically than it is biologically. People can define you in or out of the race at any time they feel like it. And one of the powers that we've given and permitted the European to have, you see, is that power to define ethnicity in a way that suits his will and his wishes. So now, in order to water down and knock down African unity and sense of peopleness, we will now create a new ethnic group, and that is the one called mixed. Knowing that some of you seeking to escape your blackness and escape your African heritage and so forth will eagerly move toward that group, and you'll get a little differential crumb for identifying yourself that way, and therefore the burgeoning and developing power of African people can be broken, and our subordination can continue. This is the kind of game that is going on when you let another people define who and what you're about. It also lets you know then that the identification of black people the world over as African people is a major threat to European dominance. Otherwise, there would be no need for them to do what? Redefine you ethnically. They are motivated then to redefine the ethnic group, because redefinition of it means the minoritizing of the ethnic group, and therefore the more you fracture and minoritize a group, the weaker that group is, and that group then cannot overthrow you. When you are a minority, you gain power by minoritizing everybody else. And this is the game. And therefore, if identifying ourselves as Africans, regardless of nationality, is a threat to Europeans, you're going to find your children reject being called what? African. You're going to see them have what? Identity problems in school, not knowing who or what they're about. You'll see them feel anxious anytime ethnicity is brought up. When I discuss ethnicity in my college classrooms, the black students are twisting as much as the white ones. Do you have to touch this matter? And the anxiety gets so thick in the room, you can cut it. Suffering, don't bring attention to this. Let's not talk about this as a people. The whites feel threatened by it, and many times the black students feel threatened as well. But yet it is a necessary process we must undergo if we are to achieve power as a group. So you will see then the characteristics of identifying with the ethnic group, the ability to think in certain ways, the ability to use language. Ladies and gentlemen, the word is a very, very powerful thing. First there was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God, and you see what? The creation of the world through the use of the what? The image and the symbol. This building was not thrown up by a haphazard throwing together of bricks. It was the result of the manipulation of symbols, the result of a social interaction between people. People of various professions and groups and levels and so forth, talking and relating to each other in some social system and social means and relating to each other. People who use figures and drawings and symbols and so forth. And it is out of this symbol-making process, this ability to manipulate symbols, of which words are, that creation takes place and that ideas come into concrete reality. And when you then want to rob a people of their creativity and of their ability to construct and to build and to found institutions and to found social relationships one with the other, then you rob them of their ability to relate to themselves symbolically and to use symbols very easily and to use symbols efficiently. And therefore you will have and see your children having problems with what? Language and English and so forth, and the use of words. So the trouble that you see in terms of the use of language in math and in science and in identifying themselves, the trouble you may see them in terms of being able to associate cooperatively one with the other are not mere accidents. They are politically necessary. As I've said, when we talk about the psychology of black children and of black people and the so-called maladjusted psychology of many black people, we must start from the point that the sickness of black people is a political necessity, that the sickness of our people is economically based and politically necessary for another people to exist. We could not be in the condition we are in as a people if we were in our right minds and if we were identified one with the other and related one with the other. We cannot be. We could not be in the condition we're in. We can only be in this condition to the extent that we are outside of ourselves and off our center as a people. And therefore you have a social system in which every institution is designed to maintain us in this mental state of maladjustment. Therefore, when you recognize this, that the inability to think or the distorted ability to think, to have problems with the manipulation of symbols, to have problems with math is a political issue. It lets you recognize then what must go on during the educational process. Has the white child been robbed of these things politically? Then why then are we talking about educating the black child in the same way? If we know that our children have been robbed of thinking skills so that another system could exist, they've been robbed of technological skills, they've been robbed of social skills, they've been robbed of certain character skills, they've been robbed of certain social goals and purposes and sense of self, then it means that an Afrocentric education must include these very definitely within its curricular approach and within its pedagogical approach. It will not matter whether the white folk have it, they won't have it in their system. They won't teach it over there. But in the black system and in the African system, we must have it. And we must make time for it. And we must organize the time and the curriculum and the approach for this to happen. And therefore, we cannot look at another people's system and judge ourselves and use that system for education of our people if we are to maintain our survival as a folk and to maintain ourselves as people in the future. So as a base for starting an Afrocentric educational curriculum and a curricular approach under oppression, we must found that approach upon a sound analysis of our people. Upon a sound analysis. And if you have not studied the psychology of your people, if you've not understood the psychology of your children, if you try to understand it merely through the perspective of another people who are your enemy, then you're not prepared to provide an education for African children. You must be able to do that. We have a bunch of black people who are Marxist, you know, even though the Russians are throwing it away and the Chinese are throwing it away. You know, but we bite down on it very hard. I will not argue the merits of Marx and so forth. What I look at, though, is this. Why are you taking a pre-digested system of thought? Why not do as Marx did if you want to play this game? That is also, as well as perform an analysis of the history and experience of your people. He looked at the history and experience of European people. He analyzed the European society and based upon that analysis founded a doctrinal approach, an outlook. Then if you're truly Marxist, why do not perform a true and deep and thorough cultural analysis of your own people and found your psychology and found your economic, social, and political approach based on that analysis instead of some pre-digested system from someone else and imposing that other system upon yourself. This is what it requires. So it means then that if we're going to found an African system, we must found it then based upon a knowledge of ourselves. It means that we must look at the successful systems that have operated around the Afrocentric mode and Afrocentric outlook, and where that kind of system does not exist, we must create one. At the root of reclaiming our intellectual capacity, of which we are in no doubt as to its greatness and size, we must recognize that the reclamation of our mentality, psychologically speaking, the reclamation of our sanity, psychologically speaking, the reclamation of our intellect, academically speaking as well as socially speaking, lies ultimately at the base of the reclamation of our African identity, of recognizing that we are an African people. That's at the center of it all. You cannot deny your Africanness and be in your right mind. You cannot deny your African identity and appropriately use your knowledge for your own advantage. It is impossible. As I've said, at the center of being in one's right mind, at the center of being sane, is a knowledge of reality. You cannot deny reality. You cannot be blind to reality. You cannot see a distorted reality and function in it efficiently. You will be overcome by it and ruled by other people who may have a better grasp of reality than yourself, or who are creating the reality you believe in. To deny our African identity is to deny reality. And to deny reality is to escape into insanity and not have the ability to use our own minds productively. We talk about our children being impulsive in the classrooms, talk about them being hyperactive, talk about them having short attention spans, talk about them having little self-control, being little interested in learning and motivated to learn. And yet we do not recognize the centrality of identity to these so-called issues. First of all, I've stated that our children must have problems of self-control if they're ultimately to come under the control of whom? Another people. You cannot be in control of yourself and under the control of another at the same time. And if you're being prepared to be controlled by another people, then you must be prepared to lose self-control. And you see it then early in our children when you hear people complaining about them controlling themselves. What you see is hidden behind a whole lot of psychological mumbo-jumbo, because the political purpose must not be revealed, that these children must not learn self-control, must not learn discipline, so that their discipline can come from where? Outside of themselves. Because self-control and self-discipline ultimately means they may use that self-control and self-discipline to overthrow those who would control them and discipline them for their own purposes. The creation, the European, in seeking to control us, and this is why you psychologists, those of you studying psychology, see, if you have an Afrocentric perspective, read that psychology with that perspective. It's interesting sometimes to read the psychology, say, of neurosis, and take it out of the individualistic mode and look at it politically and socially and economically. You see, that's the part of the miseducation that goes on in the colleges as well. You go into a class in abnormal psychology, and you figured in that you're talking about individuals. And of course, the Europeans presented individually. This individual is neurotic, and this one is compulsive, and this one is hysterical, and this one is that way, and they leave it at that level. Of course, one thing I must say, really the major problem we face is does not come from those people who are obviously crazy. Definitely not. The major problem comes from people who wear the cloak of what? Normality. It is what I call the normal crazy that we have to. Really, the really way out, crazed out schizophrenics are no major danger to the earth today, ladies and gentlemen. It's those people who are perceived as upstanding citizens that are the greatest danger to this earth today. And yet you go into a psychology and you study the crazies who are perhaps maybe 1/2 or 1% of the whole population, or even less than that, and you think you're studying that normal psychology. But it's the quote-unquote normal ones that are ready to drop those bombs. You see, it's the normal ones that will drop that pollution on your beaches. You know, the normal ones who really ultimately threaten the integrity of the world and exploit the world. Because you see, if you're crazy enough, we'll just put you in the institution and put you out on the streets of New York and let you go. But it's those that what? It's those crazies who have made their craziness be redefined as what? Normality. That is the problem. Not the other way around. And who then will drive other people crazy in service of their own crazy goals, in service of their greed, in service of their exploitative needs. in service of their vanity and of their lust. And therefore we have a crazy and mentally ill people who are now in control of the world's circumstances and who then seek then to have their craziness defined as normality and to have those who can be normal defined as crazy and to strip then the other people out of their minds. For instance, then when you look at, say, get a description of, say, what we call the hysterical personality, instead of looking at it as an individual situation, elevate it to a group situation. Elevate the thought styles. One of the very good books in the area is a book by a guy named Shapiro called Neurotic Styles. Read some of those and it's an interesting book because it deals with the way of thinking of certain people. And when you move it from the individual level and move it on a group level, I think you'll find it very, very instructive. That when he talks about the hysteric as being highly susceptible to what is immediately impressive and striking, and the individual who has a low capacity for persistent or intense intellectual concentration, an individual who responds not to level kinds of thinking and understanding, but to the most emotionally obvious, flamboyant kinds of movement. You see an individual who seems to operate not in a world based on facts and reality, but a world based purely or basically on needs and escaping pain. An individual that lacks curiosity, an individual that is subject to lose distinctiveness and factual sharpness. An individual who has a relative incapacity for sharply focused attention and concentration. If you move that to a group level, you will see then that the history of Europeans has been one of trying to create that kind of mentality in black people. And then in claiming to be liberal, will introduce this kind of mentality into the school system. And then when that mentality cannot meet the demands of the school system, define them as being deficient and backwards and in need of remediation. You see the kind of game that's going on there? And therefore you have a system then that is not defined to correct these kinds of characteristics that have been politically, socially, and economically inculcated, but in a sense adds to their weight and compounds the problem even more. But when you see and study then, not only on an individual level of how people are driven to this kind of thinking, but on a group level, you begin to see then where and how the education of our children must take place. He talks about another style in there called the impulsive style, which feeds to a great extent into drug addiction and addictions to all kinds of things. Not only drugs, but to clothes and to sneakers and to gold and to all of the other mess that you see our people attached to, trying to get rid of the pain and trying to get over the conflict within our personalities. And he describes that personality as lacking in aims and interests and goals and values that extend beyond the immediate concern of their lives. They're indeed lacking in essential equipment for the successful modulation and development of impulse or whim, or for resistance to impulse or whim. How are you going to resist an impulse if you have no goals and purposes? How are you going to resist a whim if you don't have an ideal toward which you're striving, or have a character that you're trying to build? If you don't go beyond your own sensuality and beyond your own sense of pleasure, if your life does not extend into areas beyond your own skin, what is the need for controlling then a whim or an impulse or a quick desire? Why not feed that desire right then if really your life and your vision of yourself is only in the immediate? When the European robs you of your history, and when the European robs you of responsibility for your future, then he leaves you mentally in the present and in the immediate. And when you're left in the present and in the immediate, you are open then to all forms of addictions and all forms of manipulation, psychologically, socially, and otherwise. If you have no sense of history and no sense of culture, you have no sense of values and have no sense of self, how do you evaluate what is happening to you? How do you control? How do you know what is relevant and what is irrelevant? When you have set for yourself goals and purposes and values, whims and impulses and desires are evaluated in terms of those things as to whether they fit into your ultimate program, whether they support where you're going, how they work against where you're going, how they work against your goals and needs. But if you have no goals, if you have no purposes, if you have no aims, if you have no sense of self, if you have no sense of continuity from past to present to the future, then you have no means by which you will resist the temptations that the world laid before us. You become then what the African is today, the perfect consumer, one big mouth in which people shovel all types of garbage and junk and crap, who can only assuage themselves by eating and consuming, and only know consumption as a way of dealing with their pains. Culture, ladies and gentlemen, gives you the sense of purpose. It gives you the sense of values. It gives the sense of ideals. It gives the sense of structure. And it gives then a sense of awareness and place and position in the world. It gives a sense of continuity. And with these senses, the intellect is organized and it is focused and it is concentrated and it processes information in an organized, systematic sort of way, and it produces and it constructs and it relates and it builds and it grows and it creates positively and contributes positively to the world. An education then without a culture, an education without a sense of culture, without a sense of identity, is an education into whoredom. It is an education where you literally then train people to be prostitutes. And for the highest bidder, they will perform any kind of job, even if it means destroying themselves and destroying the whole of mankind. Only educated people can make the atomic bomb. Only educated people can make hydrogen bombs. Only educated people can make germs and diseases that destroy other people and make a life at doing it as such, because they have been disconnected from spirituality and disconnected from reality and disconnected from themselves. And therefore, it is, you must recognize then a sense of Africanness, a sense of belonging to a culture and belonging to a people, a sense of being in touch with the reality of your African self is essential to reclaiming your mind and essential to reclaiming your intellectuality and essentially, ultimately, to reclaiming yourself and coming to love yourself and your people. And a program that is adequate for the education of Black children and adequate for the education of Black people must have at its very center a reclamation of the African identity and of the African reality. Thank you very much for your attention.
No, excuse me, the sister behind you.
Educating ourselves.
To whom?
Logic. Logic.
Yes.
Don't get it.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, in fact, when I talk about curriculum and pedagogical approach more specifically, that is one of the very central subjects that I speak to, that I see as of major importance. As I indicated earlier, that this system, to a very great extent, even as I indicated earlier, that this system, to a very great extent, even if you are even not African, is one that really is based on people's inability to think, or to think in very narrow terms. This system, frankly, cannot afford to truly educate any of its people. And it can only educate a small group who can think, though, but think within the narrow confines of profession. As I indicated, too, that one of the major things, one of the major means by which we are ruled is through our emotions. And, of course, to rule the people through their emotions, one of the things you must strip them of course, is the capacity to reason, or if you don't strip them of the capacity to reason, you disconnect the reasoning from its ability to influence their behavior. You see, and so you see in both instances, in the Europeans' domination of African people, this is a major part of that, the means by which we're dominated. We are stripped of our reasoning, or we are stripped of our ability to use our reasoning as a means for influencing our behavior. That then leaves us open to emotional appeal and being ruled in by our emotions. And this, of course, leaves us open, as you see then, to addictions, to fads, to, as I mentioned earlier, current excitements, to moving in terms of feeling instead of thinking. It means then that our sense of inferiority, our sense of a lack of self-confidence and other things overrules then creates a lack of confidence in our intellectual capacity. I think a major portion of the early education of African children should be dedicated to thinking skills, to almost the exclusion of a lot of the other stuff that goes on now. Because I think the position that we take is a logical one, it's reasonable, it's one that any person, if they reason and think logically, will arrive at. And I think that if we teach our children to think and control to as much as possible their behavior in terms of their thinking, they will arrive at the conclusion that Afrocentricity and the African tradition and being identified with our people and using what they knew for our people is the logical and right thing to do. But we must impress upon it. But to do that too, we must have goals, you see, as a group. We tend to think of children as individuals when they learn, but we must recognize that children learn within a social context. By that I mean the culture and the society sets goals and sets purposes and values that influences the way a child learns and why he or she learns. I've often stated that we as African people suffer from the fact that we have no enemies. Yeah, we essentially have no enemies. We want to be loved. We want to be accepted. We want people to identify us with their traditions. And that way we get cheap credit. We don't have to work for it. We just assume that we are Americans, and therefore whatever Americans have accomplished, we have accomplished, We see our first goal often as that of being accepted and assimilated. And those are very emotional goals. That leads then to an emphasis not on thinking, but upon being accepted. When you have enemies, it forces you then to what? To outthink. You see, it gives you a purpose for thinking and organizing knowledge and information. When we make up our minds as people that we're really going to overthrow European power, that we're really going to become masters of our destinies, and that becomes a part of our culture, and that becomes a part of our family, you will see, too, our children's approach to knowledge and information changing, and you will see that thinking coming to the fore, because we basically can only outdo these people and master ourselves by what? Outthinking them and learning to be what? Realistic and objective on certain levels. So I emphasize thinking. That's, in fact, one of my number one emphases when I talk about the education of our people. Yes, ma'am.
Sister here. Sister here.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Okay, based on what you told us today, I'd like to apologize to my daughter in public in front of the family for the way that I've been pushing her in the school system.
Well, we got it. We all have it in us to some extent.
According to their law, I still have to send her to their school school system. So how do I reconcile
Mhm.
what she is learning at home with what they're trying to do? I mean, she goes to the school and tells the teachers what she hears at the lectures, and the teachers are flabbergasted.
Yeah.
So she's teaching what she's learned here and what she picks up from what we're saying. And I mean, it has come to a point where they tell me to stop teaching her at home because she's so hard.
Yes.
And I found, like what you're saying, it frightens them.
Oh, yes.
When I had her in the school and they were going to give an algebra class, she was the only one ready. They kept back their old white kids because they did not want to teach her. But it's like I owe her an apology from the bottom of my heart, because from the time she started, I thought that she had to excel like they did, and she was far in advance, and I didn't recognize that she is a different child. She is not white, and that there is a different psychology.
Okay, I appreciate it. You strike a major dilemma that we all face. I mean, when I talk about the education of our children, obviously I know at this point we are not totally and fully prepared as a community just to flip over the educational system. Hopefully we will in the future. One of the other things that I talk a good deal about publicly, of course, is that of economic development and how important economic development is to us. And one of the reasons why I press that is so that we can begin to purchase and finance our own educational system, or at least educate in a deeper way those who will lead or who will contribute in some way to the guidance of our people, and sort of polish up those who might have gone through the other systems and need some further education. The development of an economy is so essential to the education of our people. We must have that. I mentioned the AIDS situation here earlier. I've said that there are some people who are going around now talking about AIDS being put up on us by some other people, and it's a part of germ warfare. And while that may be true, it does not necessarily, while it's a major step in our understanding what AIDS is about, it does not solve the problem for us to recognize who is responsible for putting it on us. It must also have us recognize, must make us recognize then that we're entering an era of warfare that's very subtle but fatal. And it's a warfare that's going to center around educational research institutions. In other words, if people release an AIDS virus on you, then the resources that you have will be your own educational institutions and research institutions that will have to go into action to develop a vaccine, a preventative of some kind, to inoculate the people against this kind of warfare. So it becomes very necessary for us not only to point the finger at who is discovering the virus and putting the virus out there, but to develop a full educational system as a means of defense. So when I talk about education as defense, again, I'm not just speaking psychologically, I'm speaking biologically and physically, that it's going to, because at the center of germ warfare is the idea of, in what way can we release a germ on a vulnerable population and yet protect our people against that germ so that that population can die and ours would continue to live? And what capacity does that vulnerable population have to develop a means of defending itself against the release of that germ? You see, now what is going on here? A disease has been released upon our people, and yet when you look at the state of our educational institutions and of our research institutions, we are in no way prepared to defend ourselves against those interests. I'm saying all that to, again, emphasize a sort of a pet project of mine, and that is the necessity for us to develop economically, and so that we can build an educational system for ourselves, a research system that defends us as people. Because again, if we don't have these institutions, our knowledge is not going to be enough to save us. We're going to have working institutions. Now, in terms of what you're saying there, when a child or when a person has an appropriate sense of culture, an appropriate sense of self and self-love and self-confidence, they can be exposed to the other system and survive quite well. And Because when you have that sense of purpose and culture, you know what to get out of that system and what to leave there. Culture provides a type of selectivity that can permit this. And I attack the nationalists sometimes because they get so carried away. Until they don't have anything to do with white folk, and I don't even want to be around them, I don't even want to touch them, I want to do this. And I said, well, brother, if you're really that secure in your African identity, they won't rub off on you, you know. And so you won't come back with the chalk, you know. So when you really soundly identify and know who you are, you can move into those systems, get out of those systems what you need, leave back the other stuff you don't need. Look and even use and go into them even as an intelligence operation. See why those people are thinking. Look at the lies, why they lie, how they lie, you know, things like this. And also there is some knowledge and information that is useful, that can be used and transported back for our own purposes. So those of us who have children in these schools, and because we don't have alternatives, many times we don't have alternatives to send them other places right away, because we have not yet organized ourselves in our community to provide the amount of alternatives we need. We have not taken over the educational system, as I talked about earlier. Then we counterbalance that kind of education with cultural training, with a sense of identity, with a sense of purpose. And I see you have accomplished that. Then you can push for achievement. You can push for the full development of the person's intellectual capacity and ability under those circumstances, because you know it is still within an Afrocentric context, so that the person is developing their intellectual capacity for the right reasons. You see, so you can still push her to go ahead and develop herself intellectually. Don't slack up on that. As long as she's got the Afrocentric identity and knows where she's going with it, you know, just keep on doing it. She'll come out all right. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Wilson,
Yes, ma'am.
I have about 4 things down here that I ask you about, and what can we do about it. One of the main things that I'm concerned about, having worked in an Afrocentric institution and still is the adult population. What can we do with the African people who are even coming to lectures, even being in the presence of all this history and education? How can we deal with communication to them as far as their responsibility is concerned, eliminating some of the fears that they have, taking a full participating part in their responsibility? AIDS, as it is today, it is here, it does exist. What about our responsibility as adults, teaching our sons responsibility, as men becoming aware of their responsibility in our community? Responsibility. The responsibility is our protection as African people, and we set that aside to take on materialism. What can we do about that? Rutgers, one thing about the European is he doesn't hide what he's going to do to you. Rutgers in New Jersey and Johnson & Johnson are doing gene studies. They have set up $1 trillion lab where they're studying the genes. They're using AIDS as a means to alter. They say it is the best, it's one of the main diseases that they can use for everything, because it attaches itself to every kind of disease. My feelings is that as African people, that we, and only we, can change what is happening to us by teaching responsibility to our children. And as adults, we're not communicating. We need classes in how to communicate.
Yes.
And I'll point out what I mean. I go to lectures on a large scale and have been going for a long time. I've seen a lot of our men there. And I have seen occasions, I deal with my new thing, where the men don't even get up and let the women sit down. That's just very minute. I see today even women are still not teaching their sons responsibility in hand about the prayer in the world. So I think that until, and I don't know what you think about it, I know that a woman will never be able to change what is happening to our men that are already grown. And it's so serious, till I think that we need to seriously think about communication, strong senses of responsibility. And if it's not spoken to people like you, and you talk to other men,
our young men are going to be destroyed. I don't care how many books we write.
Yes.
If we don't teach responsibility and how to listen and to think, we're going to be wasted by our own means. And that's why I set out those things.
Okay. It's quite a task because I don't claim to be able to provide the answers to the issues you raised, and I don't feel bad about not being able to do so because, of course, the responsibility, as you mentioned the term, is ours to assume, and ours as people to come together on, and through interacting with each other, arrive at the appropriate answers, and of course, to try various means of arriving at the appropriate answer. We must not be afraid of experiment and systematic trial and error of arriving at our answers. When I talk in more specifics, as with the first question, in addition to emphasizing thinking skills, one of the other things I focus on in terms of developing a relevant curriculum, of course, is what I call social skills. Social skills training, a very deliberate, laid out course where the kinds of manners, the way of relating socially in the cultures that would enhance our culture should actually be taught to our children, not something that just comes up by the wayside or you try to teach when they're in the playground or incidentally while you're correcting the students in the classroom. But I think social skills, the ability to relate and to cooperate and work with others socially, should be a conscious, laid out and developed program in the early education of our children. One of the other things that I list as a part of this Afrocentric education is that of what I call listening skills. One of the greatest problems I find among our people is the inability to listen. And, I differentiate between hearing and listening. You can have good hearing, but you still may have an inability to listen. In order for information to come out correctly and to be communicated correctly, to a good extent, it must be put in correctly. My students complain about having memory problems. And you'll hear some people talking about us being forgetful, particularly when it comes to academic issues. A good deal of that forgetfulness and problems with memory had nothing at all to do with the brains. I have to convince my students, something must be wrong with my brain. There's nothing wrong with your brain at all. You see, two things are influencing your capacity for recall. One, of course, is whether you're interested and motivated, because we do remember what we want to remember. And people do keep the facts and information that they are emotionally attached to. And often then, if there is a problem academically, it means somewhere maybe you're not finding the course interesting enough or on some level, and you have not found a way of making it interesting and relevant to you as a person. And if the culture has not made learning an essential and interesting part. But the other part, I find the major problem is, even when people have interest, is that they do not listen carefully and therefore do not encode the information correctly. We talk about computers, but you just cannot throw information into a computer haphazardly. It must be what? Programmed and put in systematically. And the brain is a computer in that regard, and information must be put in systematically. And once it is put in systematically, there must be a system for coding it systematically. This is where culture comes in, by the way, too. See, culture is a filing system to a good extent. It tells you the relevance of information, how that information is connected to other kinds of information, the kind of value that the information has. It helps you to classify information. You see, and organize that information and so forth. And when that information is classified and organized and processed systematically and correctly, when you get ready to recall it, it's like a clerk that goes to an organized file cabinet and is able, using that system, to pull out what? The information, and is able to do what? Present that information systematically. But if it goes in uncoded, unsystematized, if it's also unsystematically processed when it's in the system, chances are then it is going to come out in an unsystematic way, and you're going to have a problem with what? Communication, you see. How do you communicate? How do you say, and how do you sequence information in a way that is understood by someone else, and that it has some kind of continuity and internal logic? So listening is of key importance, and I think our children need to be trained, again, consciously and deliberately, to listen well. As well as you can also train many of our people into what we call attention training. The attention span is not something you just have or don't have. You can actually be trained in that area, you see. And to a good extent, when we, again, look politically, as I said earlier, you'll see many of these very basic skills missing or have been distorted. And they then have to be reconstructed or built right in the early childhood education. Maintaining curiosity must be kept alive as well. Responsibility is very, very important. We must influence our children in terms of the fact that they are being prepared to undertake responsibility, and they must be given responsibilities very, very early in their lives. Sometimes I think too much work is done by the custodians and other people in the schools. I think some tasks should be left to the children to do. Some kinds of responsibilities must be assigned to them at an earlier age so that they can get a sense. Of course, a part of social skills training involves the sense of responsibility and the sense that one's behavior has an effect on other people. And we must be made aware of that. In terms of the training of our sons, I've heard black women complain a lot about black men. And I've sort of facetiously said, well, you raised them, So, what are you going to do about it, right? And sometimes I am facetious. It's one of those kind of things I throw off a little bit. But there is also a little grain there as well. The idea, too, is that, maybe black women should have a convention or something where they kind of just sit down and discuss how are they raising these black boys and these people who are to be men. And is there maybe another approach or some other form of approaching the rearing of our boys that can be more effective in creating the kind of men we complain that we don't have, right? But, of course, that doesn't leave the men out. One of the references I made to the definition of family, I think one of the problems we've had when we try to define family in terms of the European model is that we've left our boys essentially untrained, in the sense that the European model sort of impresses us with the idea that it is the father's responsibility to train the son, and that's his principal responsibility. And but that leaves us in a dilemma. If the father is not there, or if he has problems himself, then is the son to follow or go untrained? I think when we look at the older African systems, the answer has been very apparent from the very beginning. And that is, in the older African systems, the training of boys were not left to fathers alone. You see, and there's no reason why we as a black community cannot see it as the responsibility of black males to rear black boys into manhood. You see, and re-look at it. Some of us are doing initiation rites and other kind of rite and what we call manhood training that is provided by respected elders and respected men in the various neighborhoods, so that the boys whose fathers may not be there or who have other kind of issues can still be subjected to manhood training and a concept of what it means to be a man and train into manhood. When we talk about the initiation rites in the African system, this was a system of education. It's not just a system of rituals. A lot of the European anthropologists makes us think initiation was merely a matter of maybe a little circumcision and a few little rituals. No, it's not. The initiation process actually in many African groups took places in stages. And it was like a graduation. You went from one age stage to another, often into adulthood. And this occurred as a result of training and education. And you were not permitted to perform certain social roles in the system if you had not been initiated through a particular process. In some of those groups, the scarification that you see on the faces indicated that a man had received certain training and was now ready to undertake certain adult responsibilities. If that man did not receive those clarifications or did not receive some symbol of his manhood and adulthood, often the women would shun that man altogether. They wouldn't have anything to do with him because they knew he was not ready to undertake fatherhood and the other kind of things. So we could reinstitute those kinds of things. We should train then, we can train our young men into social responsibility. I've often talked about sexual training. You talk about AIDS. We have permitted the Europeans' fear of sex and the Europeans' fear of women to infect us to such a degree that we out-Europeanize the European in the sense that we become fearful and upset when it comes to training in the area of sexuality. Now, again, when you look, and many people call themselves Africans are but Elizabethan Victorians in African dress, you see, who have not really looked at the African attitude towards sexuality and the whole African attitude towards sensuality, which is very, very different from what we see. And the African style was to what? To teach in regards to sexuality and in regards to sexual performance, and to teach that within the context of social responsibility. You see, and you can teach, for instance, adolescents ways, if you're going to have sexuality, of having a sexual contact, but at the same time having a sense of social responsibility. It's quite possible to do that. But I guess when we get over our fear of even talking about the thing, then we might get around to it. The other way, of course, of teaching responsibility is, of course, for those of us who do have some influence or who are seen as having some kind of authority or looked upon as some kind of models, to be responsible as people. And for those of us who are out here now, to begin to build concrete institutions. Ultimately, we may lecture as much as we want to. Until you build concrete social institutions, you're not going to go too far in influencing the direction of your children. When you let another people provide the education of your children, you let another people provide for their economic welfare, when you let another people provide for their jobs and these kinds of things, it's going to be difficult for you to teach responsibility for yourself. That's another reason why I emphasize economics, because when we get these economics, we provide jobs, we provide other means of having a concrete impact upon our children. Our people do not have to go and get a 2-hour lecture to learn that the white man is boss. They just go to work. You know? And they look at who's directing whatever. And we are going to give our people a sense of responsibility when we become responsible and when we provide them with something concrete in their life. And we'll find that we won't have to lecture them as much. I'm telling you, it would be there. It'll just be a part of their growing up. But our lectures are vitiated by the fact that as soon as you walk out of here today, as soon as people walk out on Saturday afternoon from the first well, they walk right into a community controlled by other people. And these same organizations have not built one economic, social, or educational institution. And for the past 15 and 20 years, while they've been lectured and lecturing about African self, the African community has been concretely taken over by other people. And you are not... And one of the, you earn, and this is another thing about educating children, you earn children's respect. And you earn your position of authority. Not just in terms of degree. See, too many of us figure once we get the degree, we should automatically get respect. Even though we haven't done anything for the community, right? Oh, you just went through, the white folk gave it to you, you do honor. I don't believe in that kind of system at all. You honor people who do something and contribute to your community. And the white system is set up that way. You got a PhD? Well, what have you written? What have you contributed? Hey, you haven't contributed anything, you haven't written anything, you haven't researched anything, you haven't given anything to the community, you're not getting promoted. You're not getting the honors. But for us, you went through it, therefore you did. Nah, you don't give people those kind of honors. You let them work for it, you see. And the thing is that what I'm trying to say then is we must then become responsible people, we must become responsible organizations, and then our children and our people will listen to us. But when you're just talking and doing nothing and providing nothing then it's almost logical that the kids say, I don't want to hear anything you got to say. Because what you're saying is what? You're not going to come in tonight. We have to face that. Yes, and we'll